The courtroom was hushed, the usual buzz of chatter replaced by an air of quiet anticipation. Rows of people sat on the hard wooden benches, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief as they craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the young woman standing confidently at the front. She couldn't have been more than 20, her dark eyes sparkling with a mix of determination and nervous energy. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone in front of her, but her voice, clear, steady, and unwavering, pierced through the silence like a sharp blade. "Your Honor," she began, her tone carrying a weight far beyond her years, "I have something to say that may change both our lives forever." The judge, a middle-aged man with streaks of grey in his otherwise dark hair, peered over his glasses. His stern, practiced demeanor showed no cracks as he nodded for her to proceed. Behind his stoic exterior, however, there was a flicker of something, a slight unease, as if he sensed the gravity of what was coming. "My name is Amara Johnson," she continued, her voice faltering just slightly before she caught herself. "I've spent my whole life searching for the truth about my father. And now, standing here in this courtroom, I'm certain. You're him." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The judge's gavel, held loosely in his hands, slipped and landed on the desk with a thud. For a moment, he didn't move. His expression was unreadable, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as he locked eyes with the young woman before him. Amara pressed on, her resolve strengthening with every word. "I know it sounds impossible, but I've spent years putting together the pieces, following the clues. I didn't come here to embarrass you or disrupt this courtroom. I came here because I deserve answers, and so do you." The judge finally stirred, leaning back in his chair, as if the weight of the revelation had physically pushed him. The courtroom buzzed again, whispers growing louder despite the bailiff's attempts to restore order. Amara's hands clenched into fists at her sides as she waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. "Miss Johnson," the judge said at last, his voice measured but tinged with something that sounded almost like vulnerability. "You're making a very serious claim. This is a court of law, not a personal forum." "I know that," Amara said quickly, her voice rising just enough to cut through his protest. "And I wouldn't be standing here if I didn't have proof." The audience's murmurs grew louder. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "Proof. What proof could she possibly have?" Others leaned forward, captivated, as if watching a live drama unfold on stage. The judge looked down, his hand gripping the edge of the bench, as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "Proof," he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Amara said, pulling a small folder from the bag at her feet. "DNA evidence. Records. Photos. Everything you need to see. I've had it all verified." Her hands shook slightly as she held the folder up for him to see. "But before you look at any of it, I need you to hear me out." The judge hesitated, his eyes darting to the bailiff, and then to the rows of spectators behind Amara. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate breath. "Continue," he said finally, his voice softer now, almost resigned. Amara stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "My mother, Sandra Johnson, told me about you before she passed away. She said you were a kind man, someone she could never forget. But life separated you. She didn't want to burden you, or me, with the truth. After she died, I found her letters hidden away in an old trunk. Letters she wrote to you but never sent." The judge's face paled. His hands gripped the edge of the desk tighter, the knuckles turning white. "I read them," Amara continued, her voice cracking slightly. "Every single one. She loved you, Your Honor. She thought she was doing the right thing by keeping me a secret, but she never stopped hoping you'd somehow find out. And now here we are." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. The judge's eyes glistened, but he blinked rapidly, forcing the emotion back. "It asterisk is asterisk the place," Amara interrupted, her voice firm now. "Because it's the only place you couldn't ignore me. I've tried to reach you before. Letters, calls, emails. I've tried everything. But you never responded. I had no choice but to come here." The judge opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked away, his gaze falling on the folder in Amara's hands. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for his next move. Then Amara said the words that shattered whatever composure he had left. "I don't want anything from you," she said softly, her voice carrying an unexpected tenderness. "I'm not here for money or favors. I'm here because I need to know who I am. And I think you need to know too." The judge's head snapped back up, his eyes wide, shimmering with unshed tears. For a moment, he looked like a man entirely unmoored, as though the foundation of his carefully constructed life had just been ripped away. "Your Honor," Amara said again, her voice almost a whisper now. "You're my dad." The judge's hand shot up to cover his mouth as the first hair slipped down his cheek. He didn't try to hide it. The room fell silent again, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. And just as it seemed the tension couldn't grow any heavier, the judge finally spoke. His voice cracked as he said, "This court will recess for 15 minutes. With that, he stood abruptly, his robe swishing around him as he turned and disappeared through the side door, leaving the room in stunned silence. Amara watched him go, her heart pounding, unsure she had just lost everything, or finally begun to find what she had been searching for all her life. As the heavy courtroom doors closed behind the judge, the low hum of whispered conversations filled the space. Everyone was speculating, questioning, and piecing together the fragments of the bombshell that had just exploded in front of them. Amara remained rooted to her spot, her legs trembling beneath her, but she refused to sit. She clutched the folder tightly against her chest, as if letting it go might make everything she had just said unravel into nothingness. She turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting a few of the curious stares from the audience. Some faces were filled with sympathy, others with disbelief. Amara swallowed hard and took a deep breath, fighting back the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She wasn't about to let their judgment or skepticism deter her. Not now, not after coming this far. In the corner of her eye, she noticed a middle-aged woman with kind eyes watching her. The woman nodded slightly, a silent gesture of encouragement that gave Amara just enough strength to steady herself. She glanced toward the bailiff, who seemed unsure of what to do, hovering near the judge's chair, like he was waiting for a signal that would never come. Amara's thoughts raced back to the letters she had found, the ones that had set her on this path. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon when she had discovered them, buried beneath stacks of old family photos in her late mother's attic. At first, she hadn't understood their significance. The faded paper, the cursive handwriting, none of it seemed particularly special. But then she saw the name signed at the bottom of each letter, Daniel Harris. The same name etched on the brass plaque outside the courtroom. The same name she had grown to know as Judge Harris. Her mother's words played like a haunting melody in her mind as she stood there in the courtroom. "I loved him, Amara. He wasn't perfect, but he had a good heart. Life just pulled us apart." Sandra had always been a private woman, rarely speaking about Amara's father, brushing off her daughter's questions with vague reassurances. "You don't need to worry about him," she'd say. "You have me, and that's enough." But it hadn't been enough. Not for Amara. Not when she had spent years wondering about the other half of her identity, the part of her life that felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. The letters had been the first clue, a lifeline that pulled her into a deeper investigation. She'd hired a private investigator, scoured public records, and even gone through the painful process of obtaining a DNA test with samples she had covertly gathered after attending one of the judge's public events. Everything pointed back to him. Judge Daniel Harris wasn't just a man in a robe sitting on a bench. He was. The 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Amara shifted uncomfortably, her mind replaying every step of the journey that had led her here. She thought about the nights she spent staring at her ceiling, wondering if she was making a mistake. She thought about the countless drafts of emails she had written to him, none of which had ever received a response. And she thought about her mother, about how Sandra had carried this secret with her for so long, silently hoping that one day fate might intervene. When the judge finally returned, his expression was markedly different. The stoic mask he had worn before was gone, replaced by a look of raw vulnerability. His eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of the revelation had physically changed him. The room fell silent as he took his seat, clearing his throat before speaking. "This is highly irregular," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. He paused, then repeated, "Highly irregular." He looked at Amara, his gaze lingering as if searching for something familiar in her features. His eyes softened, and for the first time, he seemed less like a judge and more like a man trying to reconcile the past with the present. "Miss Johnson," he said slowly, "carefully, you've presented quite a claim. But before we proceed, I need to understand. Why now? Why come forward like this, in this way?" Amara stepped forward, her knees weak, but her resolve unshaken. "Because I had no other choice," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You didn't respond to me when I tried to reach out privately. I didn't want to embarrass you or put you in this position, but I couldn't keep living without knowing the truth. Without you knowing the truth." The judge leaned back in his chair, his hand running over his face as if trying to wake himself from a dream or a nightmare. "You say you'd have proof," he murmured, glancing at the folder still clutched in her hands. "But proof doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain what your mother, what Sandra—" His voice faltered, and for a moment he seemed lost in a memory. "She never stopped loving you," Amara said softly, her words slicing through the tension in the room. "Even when life got hard, even when she had to raise me alone, she never said a bad word about you. She thought she was protecting us both by keeping this secret, but it wasn't fair. Not to her, not to you, and not to me." The judge's face crumpled, and he looked away, blinking rapidly. He seemed to be fighting an eternal battle, one that had no easy resolution. She was everything good in my life," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I loved her, but I didn't know." He stopped himself, his words trailing off into silence. "You didn't know about me," Amara finished for him, her voice trembling. "I understand that. But now you do, and I need to know, does it matter to you? Do I matter to you?" The question hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. The judge looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, regret, and something else, something that looked like hope. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, as if he were trying to hold himself together. Amara's heart ached at the sight of him. She had spent years building a picture of this man in her mind, imagining what he might be like. Strong, authoritative, distant. Those were the traits she had expected. But now, seeing him like this, she realized he was just as human as she was, just as flawed, just as vulnerable. The bailiff cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "do you wish to continue the proceedings?" The judge shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice firm, despite the turmoil in his eyes. "Not today." He looked directly at Amara, his gaze unwavering. "Miss Johnson will reconvene at a later date to address this matter properly. But for now, I need time." Amara nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this was only the beginning. The answers she sought were within reach, but the journey to uncover them was far from over. As she turned to leave the courtroom, she felt the weight of 1,000 questions pressing down on her. Would he accept her? Would he let her into his life? Or would he retreat, leaving her once again to navigate the emptiness of unanswered questions and lost time? The uncertainty was crushing, but Amara knew one thing for sure. She wasn't giving. Amara walked out of the courtroom, with her mind swirling, every step feeling heavier than the last. The buzz of chatter followed her, people murmuring about what they'd just witnessed, their eyes occasionally darting toward her. She felt exposed, as if her life had been laid bare for everyone to dissect. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to meet their stares, focusing on the bright sunlight pouring in through the courthouse doors ahead. Once outside, the cool air hit her, and she took a deep, shaky breath. Her legs carried her to a bench near the steps, and she sank onto it, clutching the folder to her chest like it was a lifeline. She replayed the judge's expression in her mind, the shock, the pain, the confusion, and wondered if she'd done the right thing. She had told herself she was prepared for any outcome, but now she wasn't so sure. Her emotions warred within her: guilt, hope, fear, and an ache for something she couldn't quite name. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She fumbled to pull it out, her fingers clumsy from the adrenaline still coursing through her. It was her best friend, Lena. Amara hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," she said, her voice soft and unsteady. "How'd it go?" Lena asked, her tone cautious, as if bracing for the worst. Amara let out a humorless laugh. It was intense. "I told him. I said everything I wanted to say, but I don't know if it made any difference." There was a pause on the other end before Lena spoke again. "Did he believe you?" "I don't know," Amara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't say much. He asked for time. I think he's trying to process it, but I don't know if he'll come around." "Amara," Lena said gently, "you did what you needed to do. You've been carrying this weight for so long. At least now, the truth is out there. Whatever happens next, you've done your part." Amara nodded, even though Lena couldn't see her. "I guess," she said, her voice tinged with doubt. "But what if he doesn't want me in his life? What if this just pushes him further away?" Lena's voice softened. "Then you'll deal with it. You're strong, Amara. You've already been through so much. Whatever happens, you'll figure it out." Amara closed her eyes, letting Lena's words sink in. She wanted to believe them, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She thanked Lena for the call and hung up, her fingers tracing the edges of the folder in her lap. Inside were the documents she'd spent months gathering, each piece of evidence painstakingly collected to build her case. It had taken everything she had to stand in that courtroom and face him, to lay her heart bare in front of strangers. Now, all she could do was wait. Across town, Judge Harris sat alone in his chambers, his head in his hands. The normally pristine desk in front of him was cluttered with files and legal briefs, but he couldn't focus on any of it. Amara's words echoed in his mind, each one striking a chord he hadn't known existed. He had spent years building a life of structure and order, carefully compartmentalizing his emotions to maintain his professional demeanor. But now, all of that had been appended. He couldn't stop thinking about Sandra. Her smile, her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about her dreams. She had been a light in his life during a time when everything else felt dark and uncertain. But their paths had diverged, and he had let her go, believing it was for the best. He had never imagined there was more to their story, that she had carried a secret so profound it could change everything. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was his clerk, a young man with a worried expression. "Judge Harris, are you all right?" he asked cautiously. The judge straightened, trying to compose himself. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed. The clerk nodded and retreated, leaving him alone once more. He stared at the empty chair across from him, imagining Amara sitting there, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. He thought about the courage it must have taken for her to confront him, to stand in that courtroom, and claim him as her father in front of everyone. It wasn't something he could ignore, no matter how much he wanted to. Later that evening, Amara sat in her small apartment, flipping through the letters her mother had written. She read them over and over, trying to glean some sense of comfort from Sandra's words. The letters were filled with love and longing, each one a testament to the bond her mother had shared with the man she believed was her father. But they also carried an undercurrent of sadness, a recognition that their time together had been fleeting and unfinished. One letter in particular stood out. It was dated just a few months before Amara was born. In it, Sandra had written, *Daniel, If you're reading this, it means I've finally found the courage to tell you the truth. I've been so afraid of what you might say, of how this might change your life. But you have a right to know. We're having a baby, and no matter what happens, I'll make sure they know how much you meant to me. I hope someday you'll get to meet them and see the incredible person they've become. Asterisk. Tears blurred Amara's vision as she read the words. Her mother had always spoken about doing what was best for her, but now Amara wondered if Sandra had been protecting herself as well. The fear of rejection, the fear of disrupting someone else's life, those were heavy burdens to carry, and now they were hers to bear too. As night fell, both Amara and the judge found themselves staring at the same sky, their minds filled with questions and uncertainties. For Amara, it was a question of belonging, of finding a place in the story she had always felt excluded from. For the judge, it was a question of identity, of reconciling the life he had built with the one he might have missed. Neither of them knew what the future held, but one thing was certain. Their lives were now intertwined in a way that could never be undone. The days that followed felt like an eternity for Amara. Each passing moment brought a mix of hope and dread, her mind cycling through every possible outcome. She replayed the encounter in the courtroom over and over, dissecting the judge's expressions, his words, his hesitation. Had she made an impression? Was he even considering the possibility? Or was he retreating into denial, preparing to shut her out for good? She spent her nights poring over her mother's letters and rereading the documents she had meticulously gathered. Each piece of evidence felt like a lifeline, a tether to the truth she so desperately wanted to uncover. Yet the silence from Judge Harris's side of the equation gnawed at her. Days turned into a week, then another. No call, no letter, no acknowledgement. Amara began to wonder if she had miscalculated, if she had underestimated the walls he had built around himself. A part of her wanted to storm back into that courtroom and demand answers, but another part, the one that feared rejection, held her back. She reminded herself that this wasn't just about her. It was about him too. She had dropped a truth so seismic that it could shake the foundation of his entire life. He needed time to process, just as much as she needed closure. Meanwhile, across the city, Judge Harris was grappling with his own turmoil. He had buried himself in work, hoping the endless stream of cases and decisions would distract him. But no matter how much he tried to focus, Amara's words echoed in his mind. Her face, so strikingly familiar yet undeniably unique, haunted him. He saw Sandra's spark in her eyes, her determination in the way she stood before him. Late one evening, after hours of avoiding the questions he didn't want to confront, Judge Harris pulled out an old box he hadn't opened in decades. Inside were mementos from his younger years, photographs, ticket stubs, and a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. His hands trembled as he'd untied the ribbon, the scent of aged paper filling the room. Sandra's handwriting greeted him like a ghost from the past, her words pulling him into memories he had long tried to forget. One letter, written shortly after they had parted ways, stood out. Sandra had written about her struggles, her fears, and her hopes for a better future. She had written about love, an enduring, complicated love that couldn't be defined by their circumstances. But there was no mention of a child, no hint that their brief time together had left a legacy. The judge's mind raced. Had she tried to tell him? Had he missed something so monumental? He thought about Amara's voice, the conviction with which she had declared her truth. It wasn't just desperation he had seen in her eyes. It was hope. Hope that he would see her, acknowledge her, accept her. The next morning, Amara received an email from a private investigator she had hired months earlier. The investigator had delved deeper into Judge Harris' background, uncovering small details about his life that painted a fuller picture of the man she was claiming as her father. The email included a scanned copy of an old newspaper article, one that featured a younger Daniel Harris alongside Sandra at a charity event. The caption identified them as a couple, and their smiles told the story of a connection that had once been vibrant and alive. Amara stared at the image, her heart aching with a mix of longing and validation. It wasn't proof, not in the way DNA results were, but it was something, a glimpse into a past she had never been a part of. That evening, as she sat by her window, the city lights twinkling below, Amara's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was an unknown number, but something in her gut told her it wasn't random. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the answer button. Finally, she swiped to accept the call. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Amara," the voice on the other end said. It was steady but laced with emotion. "This is Daniel Harris." Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. "I have been thinking about what you said," he continued, his tone cautious but genuine. "I needed time to process everything, to make sense of it." Amara swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "And?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "This isn't something I'd ever expected to face. But I've started looking through my past, through everything I shared with your mother. And I think I owe it to you, to both of us, to find the truth." Her grip on the phone tightened. "Does that mean you're willing to take the DNA test?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. There was a pause, and she could hear him exhale on the other end. "Yes," he said finally. "I want to know, and if what you're saying is true, I want to figure out what this means for us, for you, for me." Amara closed her eyes, relief washing over her. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a step forward. A step toward the truth she had been seeking for so long. But even as hope blossomed in her chest, doubt lingered at the edges. What if the results didn't match? What if, despite everything, the truth she believed in so fiercely turned out to be wrong? And if the test did confirm her claim, what would that mean for their lives? For his career? For the family she imagined he had built without her? The test was scheduled for the following week. As the day approached, the tension between them grew, an invisible thread pulling them closer and pushing them apart at the same time. Neither of them knew what to expect, but both understood that the results would change everything. Amara found herself alternating between hope and fear, while Judge Harris wrestled with a lifetime of decisions and the possibility of a connection he had never known existed. When the day finally arrived, they met at a neutral location, the air between them thick with unspoken words. The sterile room, with its bright lights and clinical atmosphere, felt like a strange place for something so personal. As they each provided their samples, their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment there was an unspoken understanding, a fragile truce as they stood on the edge of the unknown. The results would take a few days, and those days stretched endlessly. Every phone call, every email, every moment was filled with anticipation and dread. Amara tried to distract herself, but her mind kept circling back to what lay ahead. Judge Harris, too, found himself staring at his phone, the weight of the past and the future pressing down on him. And as the day of reckoning drew closer, neither could shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something life-altering, something that would redefine who they were and the bond they might share. The only question that remained was whether the truth would. The wait for the DNA results felt like an eternity, each passing hour amplifying the tension between Amara and Judge Harris. Despite their shared anticipation, neither knew how to bridge the growing silence. They had exchanged polite, guarded texts, updates about the test, brief acknowledgments of the process, but the deeper conversations remained untouched. Amara told herself she was giving him space, while Judge Harris wrestled with emotions he couldn't name. Yet both of them felt the weight of something unsaid, something more than just the impending results. On the morning, the results were set to arrive. Amara found herself pacing in her apartment, her stomach tied in knots. Every buzz of her phone sent her heart racing, only to crash into disappointment when it wasn't the message she was waiting for. She tried to distract herself by organizing her mother's letters again, carefully laying them out in chronological order. As her fingers brushed over the paper, she noticed something she hadn't before, a small folded note tucked into the back of one envelope. It wasn't like the others. This one was hastily scrawled, the ink smudged as if written in a rush. Curious, Amara unfolded it. Her mother's handwriting was unmistakable, but the tone was different, almost desperate. Asterisk, if anything happens to me, Amara, find Daniel. He deserves to know the truth, no matter how complicated it might seem. And if he won't listen, go to Helen. She'll understand. Asterisk, the note ended abruptly, as if Sandra had been interrupted while writing it. Amara read it over and over, her heart pounding. Who was Helen? And why had her mother written this note in such a hurried, urgent manner? The discovery sent Amara down a rabbit hole of possibilities. She tried to recall if her mother had ever mentioned a Helen, but nothing came to mind. She decided to call Lena, hoping her best friend might offer some clarity or at least a second perspective. Lena, Amara said as soon as her friend answered, I found something. A note from my mom. It mentions someone named Helen. Do you remember her ever talking about anyone by that name? Lena was silent for a moment, and Amara could hear the faint sound of her breathing on the other end. Helen. Lena finally said, her voice uncertain. The name doesn't ring a bell, but wait. Didn't your mom used to work for a family when she was younger? Like before she had you. Amara's mind raced. She vaguely remembered her mother mentioning a wealthy family she had worked for, but it had always seemed like a distant, insignificant detail. Could Helen be connected to that part of her mother's life? And if so, what did she know about Daniel Harris? Fueled by this new lead, Amara began scouring through her mother's belongings for anything that might point her in the right direction. Hours later, she found a faded business card tucked inside an old wallet. It bore the name asterisk Helen Marshall asterisk, and an address that was only a few neighborhoods away. The discovery sent a jolt of excitement through her. Without overthinking, she grabbed her coat and headed out the door. Meanwhile, Judge Harris was also dealing with an unexpected twist. That morning, as he prepared himself for whatever the DNA results might reveal, an email popped up in his inbox. It was from a colleague at the courthouse, a fellow judge who had been a close friend years ago. The email was brief, but carried a weight that left him stunned. Asterisk, Daniel, I think you need to see this. It's about Sandra. Asterisk. Attached was a scanned copy of a letter addressed to Sandra, written by someone named Helen Marshall. The letter, dated shortly before Sandra's passing, was filled with cryptic references to secrets that couldn't be kept forever and a plea for Sandra to do what's right. But the most jarring part was the closing line. Asterisk, if you don't tell him, I will. Asterisk. Daniel's chest tightened as he reread the letter. Was this Helen referring to him? And if so, what truth was she urging Sandra to reveal? He felt a mix of anger and confusion. Why had Sandra kept so much from him? And why was this coming to light now, after all these years? As fate would have it, Amara and Judge Harris arrived at Helen Marshall's house within minutes of each other. Amara had just knocked on the door when she heard the sound of a car pulling up behind her. She turned, and her breath hitched when she saw Judge Harris stepping out of the vehicle, his expression a mirror of her own shock. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice laced with disbelief. I could ask you the same thing. Amara shot back, clutching the business card in her hand. I found this in my mom's things. It led me here. What about you? Judge Harris hesitated, holding up a printout of the letter. A friend sent me this. It seems Helen knew more about your mother. Before either of them could say more, the door opened to reveal an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked from Amara to Judge Harris, her expression unreadable. I've been expecting this, she said simply, stepping aside to let them in. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension as Helen led them to her living room. She motioned for them to sit, but neither did. They stood opposite her, waiting for answers. I suppose you've both uncovered enough to bring you here, Helen began, her tone measured. But there's more to this story than either of you realize. Amara's heart raced as she listened, while Judge Harris's jaw tightened. Helen's presence alone had shifted everything, and the weight of her words hung in the air like a storm about to break. Whatever she was about to reveal, it would change everything. Helen sat down, her gaze fixed on the floor for a moment before looking up at Amara and Judge Harris. There was a heaviness in her expression, as if she had been carrying a burden for far too long. Sandra came to me years ago, Helen began, her voice steady but tinged with regret. She was scared, unsure of what to do. She told me about you, Daniel, about your time together, and about the child she knew you didn't even realize existed. Amara's breath caught, and Judge Harris stiffened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Helen sighed deeply and continued. Sandra wanted to tell you, but she didn't know how. She was afraid of disrupting your life, of how you'd react, of what it would mean for Amara. So she decided to keep the truth to herself, but not without leaving behind some breadcrumbs. She always hoped you'd find your way to each other eventually. Judge Harris's voice was low and strained as he spoke. Why didn't she come to me? Why leave me in the dark for all these years? Helen hesitated before answering. It wasn't just fear. There was something else, someone else. She reached for a small box on the coffee table and opened it, revealing a stack of photographs and letters. She pulled one out and handed it to Amara. This is what Sandra wanted me to protect. Amara took the photograph, her hands trembling. It was an old picture of her mother, holding a baby. Standing beside Sandra was another man, his arm draped protectively over her shoulder. Amara felt her stomach drop as she stared at the face of a man she didn't recognize. Who is this? She whispered. Helen's expression grew somber. His name was David. He was Sandra's closest friend, and someone she turned to when she felt completely alone. After you were born, Sandra allowed him to step in as a father figure. But it was never official, never permanent. He cared for you, but he wasn't your biological father. That's why she left that note for you, Amara. She wanted you to know the truth, but she also wanted to spare you the confusion of thinking David was more than he was. Judge Harris's voice was tight with frustration. So, this whole time, I've been questioning everything, and now you're telling me there's someone else involved. How am I supposed to make sense of this? Helen nodded slowly. I know it's a lot to take in, but the truth is, Sandra didn't keep these secrets to hurt you. She was trying to protect you both in her own way. And now you have the chance to uncover the truth for yourselves. As Helen spoke, Amara's phone buzzed on the coffee table. The sound jolted her back to reality, and she glanced down at the screen. The results had arrived. Her heart pounded as she hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone. Judge Harris noticed and stepped closer, his expression unreadable. Open it, he said softly, his voice carrying an undertone of both fear and determination. With a shaky breath, Amara swiped to open the email. Her eyes scanned the document, her mind struggling to process the words in front of her. She felt a sudden rush of emotion as the truth became clear. It's a match, she said, her voice breaking. She looked up at Judge Harris, tears streaming. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Judge Harris exhaled sharply, his hand running through his hair as he tried to absorb what he had just heard. I don't even know what to say, he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. I've missed so much. I should have been there for you. Amara stepped closer, her voice steady despite the tears. You're here now. That's what matters. But just as the tension seemed to break, Helen cleared her throat, her expression grave. There's one more thing you need to know, she said, her tone cautious. Sandra didn't just keep secrets from you, Daniel. She was also running from something, or someone. Both Amara and Judge Harris turned to Helen, their expressions filled with confusion and alarm. What do you mean? Amara asked, her voice trembling. Helen handed them another letter, this one addressed to Sandra. Before she passed, Sandra received this. It was from David. He was trying to reconnect, but there was something unsettling in his words. He wasn't just looking for closure, he was looking for something more. Something she couldn't give him. Judge Harris scanned the letter, his jaw tightening as he read the cryptic words. Sandra, you can't hide forever. You owe me the truth, just like you owe it to Amara, it read. The tone was possessive, almost threatening. A chill ran down his spine. You think he's still out there? He asked, his voice low. Helen shrugged, her face etched with worry. I don't know, but if he is, he might not be happy to learn that Amara found you. The revelation left them reeling, a new layer of uncertainty and danger woven into their already complicated story. And as Amara and Judge Harris exchanged a look of both solidarity and unease, they realized that their journey together was far from over. The truth had brought them closer, but the shadows of the past still lingered